On paper, the Soviet five-year plans created miracles in world industrial history. In little over a decade, a backward agricultural nation built a massive system of steel, coal, machinery, and military industry. When the first five-year plan launched in 1928, the Soviet Union was still an agrarian society of wooden plows and horse-drawn carts. By the time the second five-year plan ended in 1937, it had become the world's second largest industrial power after the United States. Tractor factories, automobile plants, aircraft manufacturing facilities, they all rose from nothing at astonishing speed. But this speed came not from technological progress or institutional innovation. It came from extreme, systematic violence. The method behind this industrialization drive was simple and brutal. It turned the entire country into a giant construction site and munitions factory, achieving its goals through systematic repression and resource extraction. It did not rely on market incentives, technological innovation, or the genuine enthusiasm of workers. It relied on three things: grain seized from the mouths of peasants, free labor extracted from the bodies of prisoners, and the threat of death hanging over every single worker. First, a fundamental question must be answered. Where did the initial capital for industrialization come from? Every country that underwent industrialization needed enormous startup funds. Britain had the enclosure movement and colonial plunder. The United States had European capital inflows and the dispossession of Native Americans. In Stalin's view, the Soviet Union had only one source of capital, its own peasantry. Stalin's approach was to treat agriculture as an internal colony. Through the forced collectivization of farms and the campaign to liquidate the kulaks, the state stripped the peasantry of their last reserves of grain and property. The label kulak itself was a fraud. By official definition, any peasant who owned a cow, a horse, or a few acres of decent land could be branded a kulak. In many villages, people were branded kulaks simply for refusing to join the collective farm or because the local cadre didn't like them. Once branded, the fate was sealed, all property confiscated, the entire family deported to the wastelands of Siberia or the Arctic Circle. Those who survived were forced into collective farms, stripped of all rights to their own land and the fruits of their own labor. Grain requisition squads went into the countryside with armed men not to buy grain, but to seize it. These squads were composed of Communist Party members, Young Communist League activists, and NKVD officers. Their mission was simple and clear: collect grain according to quotas handed down from above. How were those quotas determined? Not by the actual harvest, but by calculations made in Moscow offices, disconnected from reality. The center demanded a certain number of tons from each region, and local officials had to meet those targets. When the peasants couldn't deliver, the squad searched every house, dug up grain hidden in cracks in the walls, buried in the ground, the very last sacks that families had saved for their own survival. They forcibly took away the peasants' winter food reserves and next year's seeds, selling them abroad in exchange for industrial machinery. Throughout the early 1930s, Soviet grain exports did not decrease because of domestic famine. They actually increased significantly. 1931 saw record grain exports, and it was in that very same year that the famine began to spread on a massive scale. Grain was shipped from starving villages to ports, loaded onto freighters, and sent to Germany, Britain, and other European countries exchanged for lathes, generators, and steel-making equipment. This man-made famine killed between 7 and 10 million people across Ukraine, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan. In Ukraine, the region known as the breadbasket of Europe, the situation was most catastrophic. Entire villages were starved into extinction. People ate tree bark, grass roots, rats, dirt. In extreme cases, cannibalism appeared. Bodies lay on roadsides with no one to bury them. Survivors recalled walking down roads and having to step over corpse after corpse. This was the initial capital of Soviet industrialization startup funds, purchased with several million human lives. After this bloody capital accumulation was complete, the next question was, who would do the work? The answer was the Gulag. The source of labor was even more staggering. The Gulag camp system became the core engine of this industrialization drive. In the West, major construction projects were built by hired workers. In the Soviet Union, they were built by prisoners. The core logic of this system was simple: Since these people had been declared enemies of the people, their lives no longer had any value except as expendable labor units. Peasants branded as kulaks during collectivization, the vast majority owning nothing more than a few acres and a couple of animals. Officials and intellectuals accused of being enemies of the people during the Great Purge, including Central Committee members, Red Army generals, and members of the Academy of Sciences. Entire ethnic groups collectively deported Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Kalmyks, Ingush, whole nations, men, women, children, the elderly. All were packed into freight trains and shipped to construction sites in Siberia, the Arctic Circle, and the Far East. These trains were called prisoner specials, sealed freight cars, no windows, no toilets, no food, no water. A single journey often lasted weeks. When they arrived at their destination, there were always bodies that needed to be carried out. They worked in temperatures of -40 degrees, dressed in thin clothing, for 12 to 14 hours a day. Using the most primitive tools, shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, they dug canals, laid railway tracks, and extracted minerals from the frozen earth. The reason for using primitive tools was not that the Soviet Union lacked machinery, it was that prisoners' lives were cheaper than machines. An excavator required investment to purchase, needed fuel, needed maintenance. A prisoner only needed minimal food to sustain a few days of work capacity, and when one died, the trains brought more. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, the Moscow-Volga Canal, the Kolyma gold mines, the Norilsk nickel mines, the port of Magadan, the Vorkuta coal mines, the Karaganda iron mines. These were the showcase projects on the Soviet industrialization report card. The White Sea-Baltic Canal stretched 227 kilometers, dug entirely by prisoners with shovels and wheelbarrows in less than 2 years. An estimated minimum of 25,000 prisoners died on that construction site. That averages to over 100 bodies buried beneath every single kilometer. Human life here was precisely calculated as a unit of labor. The Gulag administration had an elaborate food ration system. Prisoners who fulfilled over 100% of their labor quota received a higher calorie diet with more protein. Those who completed 80 to 100% got the standard ration. Those below 80% had their rations cut. Those who couldn't complete even half were reduced to starvation-level rations, effectively a slow death sentence. When a prisoner died, a new one was brought in immediately, as routinely as replacing a broken machine part. In the Kolyma gold mines, the first generation of prisoners died digging the shafts. A second generation was shipped in to expand the operations. A third generation mined new veins deeper underground. Gold production rose continuously throughout the 1930s. This is how the Soviet gold reserves were filled with the lives of generation after generation of nameless human beings. The repression that fueled industrialization was not confined to the labor camps. In factories and mines, the free workforce lived under militarized control. On the 27th of December 1932, the Soviet Central Executive Committee enacted the notorious internal passport system. Urban residents were issued passports. Peasants were not. What did it mean to have no passport? It meant you were permanently locked into your collective farm. No passport, you could not leave your village. You could not seek work in a city. You could not move freely. You were bound to the land like a serf in the feudal era. For workers, the passport system was equally a tool of control. In 1938, Soviet labor discipline was further tightened, being 20 minutes late now constituted absenteeism. The penalty for absenteeism was no longer a fine or a warning. It was immediate dismissal and loss of your state-allocated housing. What did that mean? It meant you and your entire family thrown onto the street. In the Soviet winter, that was a death sentence. In 1940, the law became even harsher. 1 day of unauthorized absence now triggered criminal prosecution, punishable by 2 to 4 months of compulsory labor at your own workplace, with 25% of your wages deducted. This was not a labor contract dispute. This was a criminal offense. Workers had become de facto prisoners just without the barbed wire. Workers were forced into socialist competitions, endlessly breaking production records. The Stakhanovite movement created one labor hero after another, a miner who extracted over 100 tons of coal in a single shift, far exceeding the quota. He was awarded medals and became a national celebrity. What was less known was that his record was achieved with other workers doing the preparatory work for him, using the best available equipment. And the other workers were told, if Stakhanov can do it, why can't you? Quotas were sharply raised, wages were driven down. Those who couldn't meet the new targets were branded saboteurs. And what did that label mean? It meant you had been transformed from a laborer into an enemy of the people. It meant you would be arrested, tried, and sent to the labor camps to perform even more brutal work. The situation of engineers and technicians was equally precarious. Any technical malfunction or production accident, which would have been normal given outdated equipment, scarce materials, and impossible deadlines, could be interpreted as deliberate wrecking. A 20-year-old machine running beyond capacity finally broke down. This was not natural wear and tear. This was wrecking. A batch of products showed defects due to poor quality raw materials. This was not a material problem. This was wrecking. The person responsible faced not criticism or re-education, but execution or the camps. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union conducted the Industrial Party Trial, the Menshevik Center Trial, and a series of other show trials targeting technical specialists. Large numbers of outstanding engineers were executed. Their crime was often simply this: the factories they designed failed to meet those impossible targets. It is especially worth examining how the Great Purge of 1937 to 1938 served the industrialization drive. When the first 5-year plan exposed massive problems, equipment breaking down at alarming rates, product quality so poor it was unusable, plan targets repeatedly missed, enormous resources wasted, the Stalinist regime did not reflect on the flaws of its own system. Instead, it placed all blame on so-called wreckers. This was an extremely cunning political tactic. If the plan failed because of wreckers, then it was not a systemic problem, it was an enemy problem. Thousands of factory directors, engineers, and technicians were accused of being members of an industrial party or wrecking collective. After brief secret trials, sometimes with no trial at all, they were executed. This served a dual purpose. It provided scapegoats to explain why the plan had failed, and it terrorized those who remained into working even harder. The legacy of this industrialization model is a profound paradox. The Soviet Union did build a complete industrial system. From 1928 to 1940, pig iron production grew from 3.3 million tons to 15 million tons. Steel production grew from 4.3 million tons to 18.3 million tons. Electricity generation increased nearly tenfold. Tractor production increased nearly 50-fold. This system provided the material foundation that sustained the war against Nazi Germany's military machine. Without the steel mills of Magnitogorsk, there would have been no T-34 tanks. Without the Chelyabinsk tractor factory converted to tank production, there would have been no armored tide rolling forward on the Eastern Front. But the price of this achievement was staggering. It was purchased at the cost of tens of millions of human lives, freedom, and dignity. It forged a development model that treated human life as worthless chaff and established an economic system in which citizens' property, freedom, and even their very existence could be arbitrarily stripped away. It institutionalized violence arrest, trial, and execution became routine administrative procedures. It normalized repression. Every citizen understood that the smallest mistake could escalate into a fatal charge. It crushed individual dignity and rights beneath the wheels of economic progress. In this logic, human beings were not the end. Human beings were the means. When we look at the Soviet industrialization miracle, we cannot see only the smoking chimneys, the flowing molten steel, and the magnificent dams. We must also see what lies behind those achievements: the bodies frozen in the Arctic permafrost, dressed in thin prisoner uniforms, working in -40-degree cold until they collapsed. The peasants who starved to death in the Ukrainian fields, their grain all taken by the requisition squads, leaving them nothing but hunger and death. The countless nameless dead who fell in the Gulag construction sites, no names, no gravestones, just a serial number in an archive. The factory workers drained of their last strength under militarized control and impossible production targets, nominally free. Their conditions separated from the prisoners only by the thinnest of lines. This industrialization, driven by repression and mass killing, ultimately created not just an industrial power, but a social system deeply imprinted with the DNA of violence. The ghost of that system still haunts those lands today.